Tonight, Jay Dyer has come back to discuss, perhaps in more detail or more in depth, some of the topics we brought up in our discussion a few days ago. So he's kindly decided to spend more of his time with me tonight. Jay, how you doing tonight?
Great. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Jay, of course, runs the website Jay's Analysis, where it's a very eclectic and interesting website where he analyzes movies, pop culture, geopolitics, philosophy, a lot of other topics. So you go there to jaysanalysis.com, and you can read his stuff. And if you should be so inclined, he also has a tab there where you can support some of his work, which I think is worth people's support out there, because it is excellent analysis. Jay, last week, or at least a few days ago, we talked about the various crises, world wars of the last century, the Cold War and today's war on terror, as being sort of manufactured crises, part of a strategy of tension concocted by, I guess, the Atlanticists or Anglo-American elite to create sort of a Hegelian dialectic in furtherance of a new world order, for lack of a better term. Could you explain that, or just go deeper into that and start the conversation?
And in reference to what was I was doing? So what was the very first point that you made in reference to what?
Oh, basically how the various conflicts, the world wars, both World War I and World War II, the ensuing Cold War that was considered a product of the Second World War, and of course the War on Terror, how these events are kind of manufactured, sort of concocted in order to manipulate the global scene to, I guess, for the bankster cabal or cartel or monopoly to I guess tighten their grip on the world.
Yeah, well, for me, I didn't learn any of that kind of stuff when I was in college doing undergrad or grad school. That was more of a project that I decided to research on my own. So what I did was just, you hear these different books bantered around in different alternative media circles. So I decided to just buy these books and read them. And that's really, I guess, what I've been doing the last 10 years. And what you come to find out is that all of it is, for the most part, pretty much spelled out, by official policy papers, by official big policy books. And so when you delve into the writings of, say, Dr. Carroll Quigley or Zbigniew Brzezinski, or particularly when a lot of the meat you can find in treatments of espionage, particularly in the Cold War, and even the mainline, histories of espionage or spy biographies, or those kinds of historical works are full of little nuggets that really help you put the puzzle together. So I think it's important for researchers to get a bigger perspective than just reading alternative news or alternative media or this or that conspiracy site, because you really need, in other words, the broader your perspective, the broader your grasp, the better off you are for understanding the world. So what I did was, when I was working on doing my grad work, I had a class that taught advanced research methods. So that was helpful in terms of getting a perspective on how to actually, source things and whatnot. But I think in order to understand the Cold War, it helps to understand the long history of what we might call warfare or strategic operations or psychological warfare operations, black operations, etc., which we touched on some last time. But I think it's helpful to go all the way back to somebody like Machiavelli, and certainly everyone's familiar with The Prince, but most people are not familiar with another work that Machiavelli has called Art of War. I'm sure everyone's heard of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Machiavelli takes a different approach, and historians really rate this as kind of the first text of modern warfare. Now, granted, we're not interested in our day so much in late medieval warfare, but what is interesting, or what we should take note of, are the tactics that Machiavelli discusses. And I should add as well that it's somewhat misleading when people people talk about being Machiavellian. That's a little bit misleading, because when you actually read Machiavelli, he's not he's not a person who advocates complete and total pragmatism. He's not. There's a sense in which he advocates the ends justify the means, but it's not set from the context or the perspective that most people take that quote to mean. I mean, in fact, he castigates unruly, immoral rulers at the end of the work that are given to vice. So it's not a completely, hedonistic, criminal approach. He very much is a believer in the virtues. But what he is talking about is that when it comes to the war, the spectrum of war, the theater of war, there are all kinds of tricks and tactics that are going to be used, and even if you choose not to use them, your opponents will. So we find all the way back in Art of War discussions of false flags. He doesn't use that term, but that's essentially what he's talking about. This is in Book 6 of the Art of War. He talks about, sending spies into enemy camps. He talks about all kinds of dirty tricks that you can do. I won't go into them all, but there's 15 or 20 that he lists there. And he even lists possibility of utilizing religious ideas to demonize the opponent. So again, not to take a side in this issue, but just merely looking at the objective fact of utilizing religious ideas as propaganda, as Machiavelli discusses. This all comes to play in the Cold War. So I don't know if you want to get into World War II per se, but particularly when you get to the Cold War, what you have from my research, and I even dug up Paul Warburg's letters. He has letters where he writes to the Bolsheviks talking about his how he's happy that the Bolsheviks have been successful, and he hopes that the takedown of the Tsar and so forth is successful. And so you can, if you know how to research and you can look up those archives, you can find out that a lot of this stuff is not conspiratorial. It's very real. So when we look at the works of Anthony Sutton, who was worked at the Hoover Institute, Sutton for a long time talked about the Western aid given to these different dictators, socialists, communists, and so forth, as well as fascists. So, for example, Henry Ford has a book, The International Jew, where he talks about the good of fascism and Nazism. And so we have bankers like I said, Warburg and others who were instrumental in supporting Bolshevism. So what happens is these revolutionary movements, and fascism is no different. It's also very revolutionary in its ideology as well, merely differing in terms of more so the methodology of how to bring about the coming great era or the new man or whatever. I won't go into all the differences of corporatism and all that. I'm sure listeners are probably familiar with most of that. But to make a long story short, the evidence is abundant that everything from the Gorky Motor Park in the Soviet Union being funded and set up by Ford. Ford went over to do that as well. We find the train of gold that came in from New York bankers to help the Bolsheviks take down the Tsar. And so when we look at the ideology of communism, especially if you've taken or studied much history of communism itself and Marxism, when you go back to Marx was funded by a stock owner, Engels. Friedrich Engels was actually a wealthy owner of stock. He was a trader at that time, and so he was the money behind Marx's ability to just lay around all day in the library and think up these big, long treatises. So it's also helpful to understand that Marxism, from Marx's perspective, is not directly opposed to capitalism. Now, it sees it as full of injustices, but what Marx says is that capitalism is a stage, an era within dialectical materialism within history as it marches on towards the final product of the withering away of the state. So for Marx is very much a libertarian in terms of his eschatology, or his end of times view, in that he believed that the state would wither away. So what I'm getting, the reason I say all that is that even Marxism itself as an ideology is a banker creation. It's a money power creation. So what we have in the history, I think, of Europe in the last 200-300 years, especially when you look at Freemasonry, which, as we said last time, was interested in ending throne and altar. The history of Freemasonry is central to much of this revolutionary fervor. So the fire of the revolution, the fire in the minds of men, as James Billington talked about, that comes out of the French Revolution, that takes a hold. Marx sort of takes up this mantle and this same candle of the revolution. This ideology is a technique. It's a technology. So in order to understand, World War I, we have to look at things like that, as well as World War II, and then into the Cold War, when the Nazis are defeated. Fascism seems to not work out very well, ultimately. So the new dialectic becomes the Soviet Union versus the United States. And there's a secret Soviet-U.S. space program this whole time, which people should look into as well. I think, which calls into question the dialectic here in terms of what was portrayed as real. And again, I don't mean to oversimplify this, because certainly there were real conflicts. I mean, in order to have the dialectic, you have to have real fights, real battles, real espionage that really goes on. Just like we look at, take the Baltimore Ferguson situations. If we look at it on the ground, there are really people rioting, and then on the other hand, we've got this rumor, which I think is itself a psyop, the Jade Helm situation. Well, that's the system's left hand in terms of Soros funding this revolution, and on the right hand you have the system preparing for mass riots with these exercises, which the exercises go on all the time. So I think the publicization of Jade Helm itself is somewhat dubious and calls into question whether or not this is something that was leaked intentionally to see what the reaction amongst the so-called patriot crowd would be. But that's a different subject. Back to the Cold War. So essentially, that's what's going on in my mind at that, like you said last time, meta level, at the level of the Bank for International Settlements, the level of people meeting at Davos, the level of people meeting at Bilderberg. They're thinking in that vein. I have a really, I think, poignant example of this. When we look at, say, I don't mean to fast forward too far, but this was just one that pops into my head. In the 90s, when we had the situation with Kosovo under the Clinton era. Well, of course, that was not Bill Clinton's idea. What happened with Kosovo was that it was very important for drug running, for drug lines and black market operations, as we discussed before. Kosovo also has mines that are called the Tepka mines. And so what happened in the 90s was the special committee group of the Bilderbergers, that is called the International Crisis Group, that was set up by, funded by Soros, and we see all the same characters there. Brzezinski's part of this group. Who else? General Wesley Clark is involved in this group. Well, the Crisis Group gets together and they write a paper that talks about, what's it called? I was just reading it earlier. Trepka, Making Sense of the Labyrinth. Okay, and you can find this online. And what it discusses is that the mines there, with these rare earth minerals and so forth, are an environmental hazard. And so what we need is the Western elite corporations to come in and save Kosovo, save this region from environmental regulations and from the evil government that's keeping its population down. So what happened was, under the cover of Doctors Without Borders, the founder of whom is also a Bilderberg member, the founder of Doctors with Borders utilized that organization to send money and weapons to the KLA. And the KLA were the Kosovo Liberation Army. By the way, pretty much anything that's named Liberation Army, Liberation Front, you can already just kind of X that out as phony in my experience, that always turns out to be a completely duped crowd of tools for some other power. So that's what's going on here. You have this liberation army funded by the CIA, funded by the West, Bilderbergers, under the cover of humanitarian aid, NGOs, Doctors Without Borders, that is supposed to take down the existing regime so that the people can be, quote, free, and so that the very lucrative mines in that region will no longer be an environmental hazard. Call me skeptical, but I don't believe that there's any concern over environmental hazards here. I think that this is very much, this was an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So even though this is kind of post-Cold War, this is one little puzzle piece I was reading about today that I think gives us insight into the way this game is played. I mean, on the ground, you really have a Kosovo Liberation Army that's fighting the existing forces. General Wesley Clark, formerly of NATO's supreme allied commander, who now, in the last 10 years has come out as this champion of being anti-war. Well, come on, give me a break here. I mean, he was, yeah. When you find out what he was doing in terms of NATO, his, centrist democratic perspective or persona that he puts on is kind of laughable. But yeah, I mean, again, the Bilderberg is a great example of something that has existed throughout the Cold War, and has had no qualms about making deals with the so-called enemy. Another great example of this, I have an article that deals with Western support for the Maoist guerrillas. So when the West decided that Chiang Kai-shek was useless, that he was thrown under the bus, and the CIA, this is on the CIA website, by the way, sent Bill Donovan over, the founder of sort of the father of the OSS, to train all the Maoist guerrillas, to fight Nazis. So the rise of international communism, you consistently find, always comes back to Western elites, the OSS, British intelligence involvement, and so forth. And so the network of spies that Donovan set up throughout China that are supposed to be these, horrendous communists, they're all set up by the OSS.
And Mao was Yale educated, if I'm not.
Exactly. Mao was a Yale in China.
Skull and Bones.
Exactly. And that's not by accident. Skull and Bones is just the American Eastern establishment outpost of this same Anglo-American Atlanticist establishment, which again, as I know but it doesn't have anything to do with the people of these different nations. It's the industrial banking elites, the Milner Group, Oxford Roundtable groups, and so forth, that Quigley calls the Anglophile network. So that's his terminology, and he's writing his book, as I understand, for CIA section chiefs in the 70s, so that they could understand, why are we funding communists?
Yeah.
Why is the CIA aiding communists in Albania, and so forth? So that book is written to explain that for people who are working within the system. So that's some idea I think of what is going on with the Cold War. We also have in the 40s, the CFR had me, and this is on the CFR's archives too, on their site. They're about 3/4 of the CFR and 44, 45, I believe, wanted to merge with the Soviet Union. And so they had already projected the so-called third way that people like Alvin Toffler writes about, that was the future. That was the way we needed to go. They wanted to go. And so all attempts at reconciliation with the Soviet Union should be reached for. There was a minority that disagreed with that. I think one of the Dulleses, perhaps, maybe even James Jesus Angleton was amongst that minority, if I recall. But Alger Hiss was amongst the party that wanted to unite with the Soviet Union. So
does this factor into his being outed as a communist?
I would think so,
Yeah.
particularly from the so-called right-wing side of this with the Dulles Angleton style.
It's important what you're alluding to, at least what you're trying to say, is that within this group, there are factions, and it's a human organization. So there's going to be differences and fights and squabbles, and there's going to be bloodletting and sacrificial lambs, things like that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what a lot of what we see, and then that really just adds the complexity to the matter. I mean, people talk about there being 5, 6, 7 different factions of the CIA even today. So, and then as we said last time, sometimes the CIA doesn't like the NSA and so forth. But it's more so at the meta level, as you called it, which is a good way to put it, where you're really talking about the people who are, meeting at Bilderberg, meeting at Davos, meeting at the BIS, and these are the movers and shakers that really seem to. And the one way you know that is because they keep popping up. I mean, it doesn't matter what you read. Like, you keep seeing these same types of people pop up as, kind of lurking in the background as invisible hand, Spectre type situations, Bond type stuff. So
it's almost like if you're an honest district attorney. Let's imagine there are a few, and they're investigating organized crime. He would get these pictures of these various crime bosses and have intelligence on them, evidence that they were meeting at certain places, always popping up, and from that he would develop a conspiracy theory, right?
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. Putting stuff in a local model is usually a good pedagogical tool, because everybody understands. I think most everybody understands corruption at the local level. Everybody's seen, local judges, get caught with cocaine or hookers, or the local police being busted in some scandal or something, and it's no different on the global scale. It's just that they're more prominent players. So sometimes the local drug dealer or the local whorehouse or crack house might actually have a deal with the police. Now on the streets, the police are arresting the thugs or the hookers, and the thugs might shoot a cop. And so it appears that the war is real, right? But there are backroom deals, I guess, is essentially what's. But that should just be so obvious and common sense. But again, when we think about the Cold War, I think it's important to understand the technological buildup that would come out of it. We think about the famous military-industrial complex speech of Eisenhower and all that. Well, what he's warning about is really what comes about. That's he spelled out what was going to happen, and that was all done under the auspices of the Cold War. So I'm not meaning to support communism here, but what I'm saying is that the idea that we've got to have this space race, and we've got to have this arms buildup race to be able to withstand the mutually assured destruction and all this stuff. That's all Rand Corporation dreamed up stuff, I think, especially if you read something like Alex Abea's book on the Rand Corporation. You see that they've masterminded and engineered us in that direction. We look at somebody like Herman Kahn.
That's Soldiers of Reason, right? His book.
Exactly. Herman Kahn was the kind of the daddy of the doomsday clock idea and all this, that nuclear war is eventually going to have. So Rand sitting around wargaming and thinking about, well, what happened if we did have a nuclear war? What's the algorithm that we could draw up to figure out if how many will survive, and can we actually take out the Soviet Union, and blah 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 blah. And these are all former Trotskyites that become the neocons. That's who are that's the brain trust, the defense intellectuals, as Gould and Fitzgerald call them, that make up Rand. So you have this, again, still revolutionary ideology that's running these entities like Rand, and I think that helps to explain why, when people look at neoconservative foreign policy or something like that, they have a hard time figuring out. I'm saying, the average public, have a hard time figuring out, well, why is it that we're continually, decade after decade, being engineered in this more liberal, quote unquote, liberal world order perspective, in the sense of, it doesn't matter whether it's Bush, Obama, it's not Bush and Obama and whoever else is going to be. It's the think tanks, the foundations that are driving the policy and the ideology to take us in a perspective where we can integrate into the quote global community. So any forms of sovereignty have to be knocked out. And by the way, I might add, in Tragedy and Hope, Quigley actually says that the idea for continental unions is not a recent plan. This is actually an old plan, and every different power bloc has used this. So not the Nazis had the idea for continental union trading blocs, and that the continental union trading bloc would be a stepping stone to the global government. So, well, Nazis didn't work out, but that same ideology, that same plan, which is more of a round table Oxford style plan, that is what's being implemented. Okay, so that's all this TPP, partnership, all that goes back, 100 years. So this is an old strategy, an old plan. And so looking at the Cold War, what that is the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Cold War, America, thesis, Soviet Union, antithesis, third way, blending, Alvin Toffler, etc. That's the synthesis that takes us towards global government. So, and then again, ultimately, that is kind of a revolutionary Marxist strategy of, smashing things together and then, order out of chaos, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what's going on. That is the 20th century. We're, well on our way into that. And I don't mean to ramble all day, but it's important to, I think, understand that the Cold War allowed the Silicon Valley elite, the military tech warfare elite, to utilize all of this money, all of this black budget stuff, all this black ops stuff, funnel billions of dollars, trillions over decades throughout the Cold War into all these high-tech research projects. And so that's why you have the, Bohemian Grove, I think in 83, proposing the Star Wars Defense Initiative. Now, the internet has already existed since the 60s, late 60s and into the 70s, DARPANET and ARPANET. And by 1991 or 2, it becomes just internet. But this is established by this same coterie that is involved in Iran-Contra. Okay, so John Poindexter was involved in establishing DARPA. He was also convicted in the Iran-Contra scandal. So what I'm getting at here is that even this of the octopus it's all the same types of players. And so when we look at DARPA, when we look at the buildup of the Star Wars Defense Initiative, which was DARPA, which was using DARPA, that allowed the emergence of what is the architecture of the coming tech surveillance grid and the Internet of Things. I mean, all of this is straight out of DARPA. So that's the whole, I think, ultimately the point of the Star Wars Defense Initiative was not ultimately because of, there's a strategic defense, protection, security aspect of it. But what you're going to see is that iPhones are in Russia. iPhones are in China. iPhones are made in China. The uniformity of the monopolistic system that we're under is itself, by its very nature, I guess, designed to be global. And so it's the technological aspect of it that's going to carry us into the global government, mainly through things like simplicity and ease. It's going to be easy to have a cashless society when you pay with your phone or with a microchip. And then that's really what I think the Cold War and the long-term strategy was about ending national sovereignty, forcing nations into larger power blocks, think of the Soviet satellite nations, Think about the U.S., and all their CIA puppet dictators and everything, forcing a global conflict, and then out of this you coagulate, kind of like the alchemical Soviet coagulating, the alchemical mantra. So that's my perspective on the Cold War in brief.
You have to take this broad look, because in order to get where we are today, you needed the conflicts of the 20th century, the Cold War and the subsequent War on Terror, and it wasn't just politicians responding to exigent circumstances or various unrelated emergencies, or just sort of a chain of events that were related but not really part of a plan. What you're suggesting is there's some sort of long-term plan, broadly speaking. It doesn't say there aren't turns and
right.
Things that occur within those conflicts. But broadly speaking, it's being directed in that direction, and
Absolutely.
We do have evidence for that. I think I mentioned last conversation about the Reese Committee investigations of the 1950s. At the time, I think they thought they were investigating communists. As they dug deeper, It was much more than communism. And I think it was Norman Dodd who hired a young lady named Catherine Casey, was her name? And she was sent up to investigate the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And she was very skeptical about the investigation, saying these foundations they're philanthropic, they're good, and she basically had the mainstream view of these organizations. But in the course of their investigation, I guess at the time the foundations themselves were gullible. They didn't take proper care to keep her out of the minutes, and she was able to go through the minutes of these meetings, and she had a nervous breakdown from what she found out, according to Norman Dodd. She couldn't handle it. She found a broad, this conspiracy, if you want to use that word, of these foundations to embroil the United States in a series of wars. And that's the only way you could transform the country and collectivize it. And collectivize is an important word because ultimately these people are collectivists, I guess. And of course they're the ones deciding things. And that in itself, I think, gave us an idea of what was going to come in the 20th century, and it did. You had the World Wars, you had the Cold War, you had the creation of the League of Nations, the Bank of International Settlements. That system collapsed. And out of World War II, we got the UN, the World Bank, the IMF. Right. And we go from there. So that's an interesting perspective. You take that broad look, so. Yeah,
it's repeating patterns. It's just like, aiding Saddam and then taking him out, putting in the next, next guy. And then he has, like we said, an expiration date when he starts to go bad and stink like milk in the fridge. But this is exactly what Toffler's book, The Third Wave, talks about. He talks about first wave society being agrarian and so forth, and then you have an industrial revolution, the second wave, and then the supposed third wave that we're destined to enter is the super industrial society, where you have the space age, the technotronic era, global village, blah 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 blah, and this is where we get into the whole green agenda and all that with the Club of Rome and Maurice Strong and these different. This is a very, very crucial arm of the think tank foundation leg of the octopus, arm of the octopus, because that's who created this whole green movement. So, in that article that you mentioned that I did on ISIS and feminists and thugs, I mean, we could throw in another one, which is the Greenies. The Greenies are just another one of these supposed, enlightened minorities that think that they have it all figured out, and because their professor with, the homosexual professor with the ponytail, and the T-shirt and the Marxist lingo told them that everything Western is bad, and that the only way out of all this is to accept austerity and living. I heard all this in college, so I saw it firsthand. I'm sure we've all seen that.
That came out of the Club of Rome.
It did. Yeah. I mean, that's the and these are all the same. All of for example, I dug up Shell white papers from Shell funding the green movement. Now, I'm sure that's not surprising to you, but I think to most people caught up in these little bitty fragmented dialectics and these little piecemeal approaches, they might think, well, why would Shell fund the green movement? Well, the green movement is central to moving towards what you're talking about, this global community, global village, the third wave, because it ultimately means that there's only the collective.
Well, why would J.P. Morgan,
like you said, there's only the global village.
Why would J.P. Morgan fund the Bolsheviks? As that Anthony Sutton.
Exactly.
But Anthony Sutton. Exactly. Anthony, as you mentioned, Anthony Sutton. I want to delve a little into his research. You said he uncovered that Wall Street had supported the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, the Italian fascists, even Sun Yat-sen in China, undermining China. They were also with Yale and Mao's revolution. His view is that funding these funding these radical groups, revolutionary groups, these wars made business sense, because what they wanted to do is they wanted to create captured markets. They wanted to destabilize areas like Russia because they didn't want them to compete with the West. At the same time, they could destabilize the region, then gain access to the resources and control the situation. Whereas if Russia were allowed to develop on its own, which it was up until 1914, it was becoming sort of a capitalist constitutional monarchy. Then it was destabilized. But that goes back to British policy with Halford Mackinder, with the controlling Eurasia. Can you explain a little of that? Because there's a British angle here, there's a Zionist angle here. Like you said, there's a lot of factions involved in this.
There are these different factions. You're right, and you've got Brzezinski representing kind of that. One of the main minds of the Cold War. So I think he's central to understanding the Atlanticist, but not necessarily Zionist wing of the spectrum, where his strategy is that because Afghanistan is the gateway to Eurasia, the gateway to the East, and it's also, again, very much a heroin, opium hotbed.
It's always there, isn't it?
So, exactly. Right, and just like with the KLA and fighting Slobodan Milosevic, it's the same situation with Afghanistan, where you've got the Rand Contra crew, which shows that the ideologies may differ, because Brzezinski might have a different ideology with neoconservative war hawk type approaches, but regardless, it's the same crew with the BCCI that's funding the Mujahideen. That's the the neocons that are funding the Contras, right, through Iran-Contra. So it's the same bank utilizing the same principles. It just might be different game plans. It's like you have a coach and an assistant coach on the team, and the assistant coach might prefer this play, but the head coach says, "No, we're going to go with this one." So I think that's kind of how it plays out on the ground in terms of policy making and strategies and so forth. But 1978 and 79 is a great example, because that's really a culmination, I guess, of 150 years of great game. And well, it wouldn't be 150; it would be late 1800s to 1978. But that's that kind of a culmination there, where the idea of funding and radicalizing Islamic jihad really is, Brzezinski steps into that role of taking the mantle of what the British strategists had done for so long prior to him. So when we understand that, then when we start thinking about the propaganda of things like, well, the evil empire and all that really doesn't have any meaning at this level. That's just propaganda to mobilize the masses for getting behind this or that war. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there is some speculation that I think is interesting. I don't know if you know who Kerry Bolton is. I don't agree with necessarily everything that Kerry Bolton says, but he does have an interesting thesis that Stalin didn't completely go according to script, and so part of the reason, again, not totality, but part of the reason for the Cold War was that Stalin was doing some things that the Atlanticists did not like. For example, the CFR meetings that I mentioned, where they were ready to offer billions in aid to the Soviet Union. Stalin apparently did not accept that aid. So, as to all the exact details of, to what degree this or that Western industrialist or banker still had their fingers, involved in building up the Soviet Union, that's still something I'm kind of trying to tease out, because this is just, Cold War stuff is really just something that I've taken on as a research project in the last 4 or 5 years. So I wouldn't by any means call myself an expert, but I definitely think that the basic principles that Sutton lays down about the funding of fascist, communists, and socialists and Soviets is absolutely true. And then so from there, it's more so a matter of teasing out, who's going off script, who's making who mad, who's actually maybe trying to set up some kind of resistance. I think in the situation with Russia now, it's interesting because, Putin did kick out certain Russian mafia guys. There has been some apparent difference in terms of what's going on in Russia. So I think that's interesting in terms of where things are going, especially when we think about that the IMF was who looted Russia for hundreds of billions under Yeltsin. So once Gorbachev sort of supposedly caved into the West, in come the vultures to loot the place. And that's exactly what happened with the Ukraine when you had the coup in Kiev. Well, in comes the IMF. So here's $18 billion, sign on to everything we want. So that's the whole thing right there. I mean, it's just like with Milosevic and the KLA. What happens? Well, as soon as Milosevic goes down, in comes the IMF. It's the
economic hitman model, I guess. That's
exactly.
You mentioned Stalin. It's interesting. Stalin didn't exactly go to script, and that's how you have to look at these things. Because although we often use terms like moving the chess pieces, the pieces that are being moved aren't pieces of wood. They're human beings, and they're complex, they're dynamic, and some people have suggested or have theorized that same thing happened with Hitler. That he went off script a little bit, and then they had to improvise. And that's why when you say these wars are engineered, it does not mean that everything is planned for. Just broadly speaking, they're planned, they're executed. They need a crisis, they need a general war. Just like some people also theorize that if you read the Zionist literature in the early 20th century, is in order to vindicate the Zionist plan, they needed a general crisis in Europe to get the Jews out of Europe. And broadly speaking, the Zionists and the SS had the same objective, to get the Jews out of Europe. And they achieved that.
Well, yeah. and who was involved in that? Lord Balfour.
Lord Balfour, who in fact, in the U.S. entry into the war, because they promised that with their influence in the United States on Wall Street, with people like Brandeis and I guess who's the guy of the economic czar to World War I. What was his name?
Economic.
Well, that's the term I'm using, but Bernard Baruch. The banker.
Okay.
And Jacob Schiff and Kuhn Loeb and these guys, and so they might have had a personal grudge against Russia itself because of Russia's reputation.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of could have been multiple motivations behind this thing, but
here's a good example I always use, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but let's say you had a local business, and let's say you were bug man and you sprayed for bugs. And in comes, let's say you have an employee who quits and he starts, thebestbugservice.com.
Yeah.
Right. So he's got the best. So what do you do? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the judge and to the city commission, and I'm going to say that the chemical that he's using is an environmental danger and that it's illegal. So I get that law passed. Puts him out of business. I mean, that's really all this stuff is. And it doesn't have to be bug spray. I mean, it could be,
That's great. Yeah, that's a great.
We got to crack down on the drug running in Kosovo, and so then we come in to run the drugs.
Yeah, that's how we kicked the French out of Indochina.
There you go. Right.
That was a big OSS operation, later CIA. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because I would just, in preparation for the interview, I happened to watch an interview with Anthony Sutton and the late Stanley Monteith. And
yes.
he says you have to look at it this way. These are businessmen. And the way you get really rich is you don't go into the market and compete with everybody. You monopolize, and you cozy up to the government. You take over the government and use governmental power to go in to take over markets, to capture markets. And that's what these guys are doing in Russia. William Boyce Thompson or Thomas Lamont, Jacob Schiff, these guys that showered the Bolsheviks with millions of dollars. They were also funding the White Russians at the time too, so they were hedging their bets. And so it isn't to say these guys were committed communists. They were they were opportunists, ruthlessly so.
Yeah, exactly. At that level, they don't care about ideology.
No.
Ideology is for dummies down on the street protesting.
And that's what Kara Quigley said in Hat, Tragedy, and Hope. Yeah, exactly.
It reminds me of the funny scene in Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield, where he gets back to college with his son, and there's this snooty, know-it-all, sort of left-leaning economics professor who's up there talking about all these facts and figures, and Rodney Dangerfield keeps interrupting, and he says, well, I don't understand. Who's going to grease the politicians? You haven't mentioned that yet in the lecture.
That's so important, because often when you deal with political science and politics and policy, and you have these so-called the approved experts talking about this, they don't deal in the real world. They don't.
That's one of my main criticisms of.
Or they think it's incidental.
The libertarian treatment of economics, much of which I think, especially at the local level, is good and accurate. I think and especially in terms of criticisms in general, they're good. Where I take issue with most libertarian economic thinkers is in terms of shadow markets and shadow banking. They never talk about that. Now, there might be some that do, but for the most part, that's never brought up. It's never mentioned. They don't talk about, algorithmic trading scams. They don't talk about the power and importance of the black markets. Every now and then they will, if they're talking about, say, legalization or decriminalization of drugs. But you never hear them discuss these kinds of things. And so, for the most part, I don't hear that. You're never supposed to talk about, black operations or false flags and stuff like that for probably 80% of the libertarian thinkers out there. In fact, when I talked about curious aspects of the Charlie Hebdo situation, I had one of the quasi-prominent libertarian called me out as he said I was a sock puppet, fake profile. So he didn't even think I was real. Okay. Just because I said that, there were questionable aspects to Charlie Hebdo. But I don't mean to get off topic.
Yeah, they do have
I think you get my point, though, is that this is an overlooked arena of especially shadow banking.
Yeah, it's just they deal with theoretical and policy, and I think many of them just think it's beneath their dignity, or they're afraid to be labeled. They'll lose their rather lowly but secure position in the totem pole. And so they don't want to bring out the ugly stuff, and they want to be called a conspiracy theorist. And that's a big problem because it's very real. But broadly speaking, I look at when I'm looking at the world wars, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and what we're dealing with today in its aftermath, which is the so-called broad war on terror, whatever they want to call it. It's incorporating Anthony Sutton's research, he pretty much called the Cold War a hoax. It was more or less, this was a sort of a financial and political coup. Wouldn't you call it that? Sort of a takeover process through centuries of sort of an early version of the shock doctrine, sort of how do you achieve your objective? You just turn the world upside down and get a new order out of chaos. And they were able to pretty much secure their control pretty much of the world through these crises. And that's where we find ourselves today. Would that be a fair characterization of the current situation? Yeah,
absolutely. The beginning of when there was the crisis in Egypt a few years ago, you have Kissinger saying this is Act One of a play. So that just minor destabilization at that time, we've just been seeing Act 2, 3, 4, 5 since then. Libya, etc., Ukraine. So it's all, and again, if somebody was a skeptic, you make a great point there. Tim, because if somebody was a skeptic, I would say, well, no, wait a minute. If what I'm saying is not true, then why is it the same pattern over and over? Why is it always the destabilization and then in comes the IMF? Why is that? Why, you have the destabilization, the riots, the economic collapse, tanks on the streets, people crying, throwing rocks, whatever, buildings burning, and then in comes the IMF as the savior. And I think that it's just obvious. It doesn't take a PhD in economics to figure out that this is just a strategy that goes back, like I said, Machiavelli talks about doing it. He says, send fake soldiers into the enemy camp to stir up dissent, to stir up division, and watch them collapse from the inside. Sit up in your parapet and watch the enemies fight each other. So, it's not any different on the global scale. The difference is that we live in a situation of power blocks. Richard Haas of the CFR says that we live in a multipolar world, no longer in a bipolar world of the Soviet Union. I don't really think that that's necessarily true. I think that's CFR propaganda about how we've got to do more to take over the world because there are all these threats out there, North Korea and China and Russia. Most of that is theatrical, because if you look at somebody like North Korea, I think much of that is staged. Much of that news propaganda that comes out, they're fake. They're fake videos. They're fake pictures. I don't know what capabilities North Korea has, but I know that the AP photos that they show me are not of a space program. They're CIA AP photos that are laughable. So, Kim Jong-un attended all the same Swiss boarding school that embassy CIA kids attend, as I wrote about 3 or 4 years ago. So I think that is another indicator that these threats are theatrical. And so when Richard Haas talks about the multipolar world of all these threats and all these crises, that's exactly what it is. You're absolutely right. It's just global. Maybe not global. Now, I guess it probably is global because, the game plan of ISIS in the Middle East, the game plan of right sector fascists in Kiev, or Pussy Riot in Russia, or, Ferguson, feminists. It's all the same strategy of rile up all these different groups and just basically create disintegration and chaos, to move things forward in the dialectical process.
And again, we've been talking about sort of geopolitics and the international application of these methods. You mentioned Ferguson and Baltimore, and how if a riot can't be faked, it can be encouraged, so let's just say, and you can create the conditions because you know what the conditions are in these cities, and it's very easy if you want to stir up a problem. And it's on record. They're on record on doing that. You had Operation Chaos in the 60s and 70s, the FBI. We do know with COINTELPRO and groups like the Somalis Liberation Army. Yeah, they were all out of Vacaville prison, and I think one of the guys was even a former undercover cop and all that. And the same thing, you can even draw on the Manson case, and these cases have evidence of some sort of COINTELPRO operation, some sort of PSYOPs operation. Same with that. Yeah, like I said, I mentioned I interviewed Dave McGowan recently, and the whole serial killer phenomenon might be a destabilization, sort of a way to atomize and terrorize society. And he was able to do the research and made the connections to military intelligence, which defy normal explanation. There's too much of a coincidence to believe all those connections would exist if these characters were spontaneous or developed, organically out of the corrupt culture of the United States. And however chilling it is, however whacked out it may seem to the average person simply isn't familiar with the tactics of the psychological warfare people.
Yes.
So go and talk about that, because I think that's such a fascinating topic, and you touched on that in your ISIS article about stirring things up, how some of these events can be either faked or created, or stirred up, or go ahead. So.
Well, think about when I was a kid. I remember seeing the Iran Contra hearings on TV, on the news, and then I remember the most prominent things from the 80s, aside from Michael Jackson or Pepsi or something like that, would be Reagan on TV talking, and it would be things like Iran Contra, and it would be something like AIDS. I think AIDS is a great example because if you remember all the stuff that the TV news outlets just bombarded people with, this was going to be just the end of the world. I mean, it was going to be tens of hundreds of millions dead in the next 10, 20 years. And I mean, it was just, imminent end of the world stuff. And then that didn't happen.
Oh, well.
So if you watch, there's a really interesting clip. I should put it in an article or something, but there's an interesting clip that somebody put together on YouTube of all the news clips that they could find about AIDS from the early 80s up until the early 90s. So about 10 years worth of AIDS clips. And you watch the progression of this. What you see is that it takes on the character of a PR campaign. Okay. Now let's flip over to towards the end of the 80s and into the 90s. A very similar campaign begins to ramp up with global warming. So when I was a kid in California, I remember seeing TV warnings about global warming and water, and if you flush your toilet twice, then you're sinning and all this stuff. So you watch that campaign and how it gets rebranded into climate change. And again, I'm not making a statement. I tend to think that HIV is probably something other than what they say it is, but nevertheless, the fear campaigns are the same between AIDS and global warming. It's all the same style. The video, the messages, the warnings that are given are the same, and yet all of the fantastical predictions that were given are completely inaccurate. There aren't hundreds of millions of people that have AIDS. That is just complete nonsense. The oceans have not risen to completely encapsulate Florida and the West Coast.
England still exists.
Exactly. I mean, there was an article in the Independent that I think Alan Watt pointed out. It was about 10 years old, 2003, 4, somewhere in there. It's really, really funny because the scientist, the expert, the scientist says that he is confident that by 2014 or 15, children will no longer know what snow is. Snow is a thing of the past. It's forgotten. It's like dinosaur bones. We will no longer, kids won't even know what it is when you talk about snow. Again, so it's retarded. I don't know how else to put it. I don't mean to be offensive, but it really is well, the news is put out at a fifth grade level now, so I don't guess that's surprising. But to get back to the question of the serial killers, that, as McGowan pointed out, very much a 60s, 70s, 80s phenomenon. Where'd they go?
Yes, he pointed that. Yeah.
This is supposed to be. This is just like AIDS and global warming, apocalypticism. Well, where are all the serial killers, right? So. Now I do read every now and then psychological publications, and I find it amusing that when they talk about, they still talk about every now and then all these serial killers that are out there. And I don't know what your views are on abortion, but it's funny to me that it's always a middle-aged white male. They never talk about the possibility of females that abort their children being psychopathic, but that's not. See, it's only white males that are psychopaths in there, and you would think that they're still, according to these psychological publications, they're still, everywhere out there, right? But as for the news presentation of the ever-present serial killer out there, we don't see that anymore, right? And as Dave pointed out, it absolutely transitioned to the mass shooter. And I have no doubt in my mind that was, a deep psyop decision to take things into the next phase. So, these things kind of go in phases. So, I don't know what's next. uh, the cyber stalker killer. I'm guessing
yeah.
maybe next, because we're seeing these movies where there's some weird movie out about people, a killer who uses Facebook or something. I forget the name. Unfriended. That's it.
The Facebook killer, which is yeah.
The
You have a
Facebook
TV show
killer,
now
right?
about
So now
cyberbullying. I think it's yeah.
there you go, and that's the direction we're going to go in, and cyber terror, I think, is going to be the big catch-all in the next 10 years, because I think they really are, even though the internet is their baby and it's their weaponized deployment, like you said, there are still U-turns and changes and decisions that have to be made for all sorts of different scenarios. So certainly at some point the internet will have to come to an end as it is presently.
The psychological warfare angle is very interesting to me. It's the most chilling because, well, it suggests that, again, that we're being toyed with. And I guess if you're familiar with the Manhattan Project and what all the testing that occurred with that, and the approach that the corruption of the psychiatric associations in the 50s and 60s under MK Ultra, and the various diseases, the Tuskegee scandal, the idea that they were in Florida, they sprayed a community with pathogens to see what the result would be. You had that, of course, that was at Ponce, the French town. They blamed it argot poisoning, and it was the
yes.
LSD and all that. So
right.
They're willing to do these things to play, to screw with people's minds. That's not beyond them. So they do these things.
Well, for a person who's skeptical of that, I would say all you have to do is look at the testing that was done on troops in terms of radiation. So I have one decently long article about the Manhattan Project and how, in my view, that was really ultimately a broad-ranging series of projects and tests that were designed to move us towards a complete attack on the biosphere, so that there could eventually be a synthetic rewrite of the biosphere. Admittedly, that's somewhat more skeptical, but when we look at where the transhumanists want to go, and with the fact that the big geopolitical strategists are technocrats, they do believe, very firmly in the rise of the technocratic age.
I guess you could say. Yes, what it's
Ultimately, yes, and so the Manhattan Project, I think, constitutes ultimately a complete study and attack on the biosphere, and ultimately MK Ultra would factor into that, because MK Ultra became MK Search, and MK Search was continued on even though after it was supposed to be shut down. All they did was just rename it MK Search and moved it to Fort Detrick. Well, Fort Detrick is where biowarfare work is done. And so what they did there was move into research in terms of electromagnetic stimulation, implants, etc. So the idea of body modification and where we're going with all of this virtual reality, blah, 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 that has its origins in terms of PsyOps back to MK Search at Fort Detrick.
Again, we're getting into an area that is more speculative, but also more fascinating and scary. But I do think there's solid ground to pursue this, because there's what we mentioned with the MK Ultra, the Manhattan Project. They have no problem with experimenting on people, and this is interesting because let's get into some of these conspiracy issues, and I really don't know what the answer is on some of these things. When you bring up Columbine or Sandy Hook or the Boston bombing, the alternative media or the so-called truth community have varying opinions on what occurred. Many of them many of them agree that what the mainstream media told us happened at these events didn't happen. Where the controversy is what did happen, which is natural, I guess. Obviously you're going to have of not knowing what didn't happen is easier than knowing what did happen if these situations are being manipulated or concocted in some way. But I've heard a lot of talk, and when some of these other conspiracy theorists or investigators, I guess, entertain theories of complete fakery, they're written off as nuts. You can't do this. Even if it were true, you shouldn't say it because it's going to alienate people. It's going to shut down people, they're not going to hear because it sounds so weird to them, despite the fact that there's evidence of extreme fakery. Would you agree that there's some strange things that are occurring? A good example would be for me, the behavior of the alleged victims. You know, whether it's the happy double amputee, the parent who just lost a daughter, you know, Bobby Parker laughing, coming out, and some of these things are so obvious. Could it be that these situations, the fakery is itself part of the psyop, and the obvious nature of it to get the people stirring, debating, and then that reaction is then being observed by the psychological warfare agents? I mean,
absolutely. And I've said that in articles and posts. And I think that when somebody said, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason you might do that is because if you can confuse the possibility in the perception of the mass and the populace as to what even constitutes reality, then you've completely and effectively neutralized the possibility of any resistance or any sort of questioning or investigation in terms of public opinion. So even though, you know, we tend to talk about, well, you know, everybody's a zombie, everybody's brainwashed. Well, yeah, but at the same time, if it wasn't, it's crucial that public opinion be controlled, be managed and swayed, or else they wouldn't exert so much time and research and money and manpower into managing it. So my thesis, my suspicion would be that what happens when you create this dust up of smoke and mirrors and layers of deception, layers of almost psyops within psyops, what that does is it just completely mystifies the public. So, you know, average Joe is not going to spend most of his time trying to get to the bottom of this. And in my own experience, in terms of actually being on the ground, in terms of investigative journalism, in 2 or 3 different important situations, in the cases that I saw, I was able to get a good picture of the importance of being on the ground. I mean, this is kind of why, you know, reporters, news agencies send reporters to be on the ground, is because there's so much potential for misinformation or deception. So being on the ground in a situation like Sandy Hook, I think would have been crucial to have a much better picture of what's going on, because there's, again, the potential for psychological warfare operations or black operations to be intimately layered with deception and intimately planned is far greater than most people think. So myself, coming from having studied the history of fiction in terms of psyops and the study of the history of psychological warfare operations from wartime into the Cold War to present, I think if you have in other words, it's more so a question of what most people think is possible. So for most people, they don't even conceive of that as possible. So that's why it's already from the outset, you know, crossed off the spectrum. That's not even considered possible. So you're crazy for even considering that. When you have a background or an understanding of the power and influence of Hollywood, of media, and their intimate relationship with intelligence agencies, it's much more conceivable. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I know for sure all the different details of what happened. But what I'm saying is that it does give me the perspective to say, well, yeah, this kind of stuff happens all the time. I mean, just a couple examples off the top of my head. Well, if you think about, what's that CIA guy's name? Mendez. He has a book called Master of Disguise, and his book is the basis for Argo. Well, we've all seen, I don't believe that the plot that's put forward in Argo is accurate, but it does give an illustration of how wide that kind of a deception can happen. It's sort of a Hollywood psyop, if you will, where, you know, they're going to go under the auspices of shooting this B movie. They're going to rescue these Iranian hostages. I personally don't think that's what happened in that situation. I think that there was Iran-Contra money aiding that revolution, but that's a different issue. That's Stephen Dorrell talks about that, and Robert Dreyfuss talks about that. But aside from that issue, that's an example of a guy who writes a book from the CIA who is an expert in these kind of staging these kinds of things. Again, hence his title, Master of Disguise. And the history of Hollywood, goes. I think there's much to suggest the long relationship between the CIA and Hollywood. There's, again, hundreds of examples that you could find from this. You can go to my site. I've got plenty. Jennifer Garner, for example, she plays a spy in Alias, and yet she's doing PR for the CIA. That's on the CIA's website. Ben Affleck says Hollywood's full of CIA, right? So, Julia Child, TV cook, well, she's also working for MI5.
Yeah.
And I mean, come on, British intelligence runs the BBC. I mean, this should be obvious stuff. You would think that people wouldn't, but they don't know this. So, but when you have all of that in your mind and background, considering the possibility of Sandy Hook, it's not hard to see how that's possible. Think about that news clip that everybody's seen by now, surely, where Conan O'Brien plays all these local news stations from different affiliates, all reading the same script. Why would that be? Well, it's all put forth on the teleprompter by these, centralized. Used to be CBS had one central locale that they sent this feed out to everybody. But it's still, the CIA Pentagon scripting that's, putting out Mockingbird media information. So it's no different. I'm just giving examples that, when we think about all of this in concert, then we can come to a situation like Sandy Hook, and we can say, well, here they are. We know there are crisis actors. That's a fact. These are real groups of people who, sign up to, I guess they want to be actors in Hollywood and couldn't make, I don't know what they're after, but, many times they're, connected to Democratic Party, especially. Many times they're connected to these international organizations that are, for example, with Sandy Hook, working towards gun treaties, gun disarmament, gun confiscation, all these. So all of that's in the background with these people. And I've been involved in exposing a national news story where there was an agent provocateur. So I exposed the guy, broke a national news story. So I've seen it on the ground. Okay, I'm not trying to say I'm like a veteran of this stuff, but I have seen how this works on the ground. I had the guy come up to me afterwards and say, you ruined all of my political aspirations. I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to be a big Democratic Party, candidate. You ruined that. I was, well, you should have been an agent provocateur. I mean, it's not my fault you did that, but I can absolutely see the potential for it.
You got into that in your Running Man article.
And
that was interesting.
So think about two great examples from film revealing this revelation of the method itself with Wag the Dog, where the producer completely films an Albanian war that's completely made up. And Kirsten Dunst is playing the little girl who's she's actually in the film, got a bag of Tostitos. And they, superimpose a kitty, and she's running with her puppy or a kitty. She's running from the bombs with her kitty. Hunger Games, actually, as well. This comes up in Hunger Games, where Katniss discovers that the Capitol is creating completely fake news stories. It comes up in, like you said, in Running Man, where, he's run away. He's actually gotten away. But for the ratings and for the propaganda, the one state-controlled network needs to have a big bloody death scene, so they just superimpose, Arnold's face onto some guy, and just Captain Freedom, Jesse Ventura comes in. And
that's like also the alleged assassination of Osama bin Laden. Yeah, just so ludicrous on its face, but it's run on the media, and people just accept it, even though it has all the hallmarks of a lie, because they provide no evidence. They dump the body in the Indian Ocean for no particular reason. It's like,
I mean, that one is just that one is truly.
I shake my head. People believe
I think it was And you can even have people like Cy Hirsch write a famous piece saying that it's fake.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how prominent, respected, intelligent the person is. This is the scary stuff. The scary stuff is how well people can be sold an ideology or a belief based on, just simple tricks, simple David Copperfield black magic type tricks, where it's that you want to believe, you want to believe that we're the good guys and we got Bin Laden. Never mind the fact that the photo of the dead guy is actually a CGI photo that they used for Gaddafi as well. It's this exact same photo.
When you talk about the psychological, the history of it in warfare is, you have intelligence operations that are designed to, say, exploit a society's superstitions or fears. And I think you've mentioned this before with Ed Lansdale when he spread the rumor of vampires in the Philippines in order to undermine the Huck movement, which was a communist, the so-called communist rebel group that were challenging U.S. control of the Philippines. And what he did was they would kidnap a member of the Huck, like they were walking on patrol. They could kidnap the last guy, like on TV where you see that happen, and they'd drain him of blood. And then they'd find their compatriot in the morning, and they think that one of these vampire type creatures got him. Yeah.
Yes, that Victor Marchetti's book on the CIA.
In Vietnam, you had the ghost soldiers.
That in there.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think it was
I dug up too.
Was involved in that. That Colonel Aquino character, which is interesting. Yeah.
I know about Aquino, but what is this?
Ghost soldiers.
Basically,
they make noises and weird. Some people think that Aquino summoned the occult. I don't know about that, but he was involved in it. They basically creating sounds and images of ghost soldiers in the jungle to create fear among the Viet Cong. It was a local superstition. Yeah.
Wow. Well, now that's a new one to me. It doesn't surprise me, but that's a new one. I hadn't heard that. Now, I've dug up a neat academic article. This guy's a leftist, probably a communist socialist, but his article is insightful in so far as he goes through an extensive treatment of CIA operations in Chile, Jamaica, and Nicaragua. And what the CIA did there was play on the local Marian beliefs. Again, this is not to go after Catholics or whatever. It's just to point out that this is a tactic that's used across the board. And even if you are skeptical, that's fine, whatever. But when you look at this guy's essay, what he shows is that all the news publications that were put out it's very, very scientifically done. So you might have, if there's a politician that you want to demonize, what you might do, for example, is have him on the front page, up at the top left or whatever, and then directly, next to that or diagonal to that, have an image that is, death. Have somebody in some gruesome pose there, right? So what happens is that the eye is immediately drawn from that image, and the way that the picture would be constructed, it would draw the eye down to the next image. So what's happening is that the mind is subconsciously associating, the politician, Javier, whoever, with death, right? And so, in other words, all of this is just outlined. Yeah. That's just one example of how scientifically this is done. But he gives plenty of examples as well of staging Marian apparitions and staging different so-called supernatural events, generally speaking, to motivate the populace, the local, playing on the local populace's superstition. So the essay is called, where was it? CIA Psychological Warfare Operations in Chile, Nicaragua, and Jamaica. So that's a good one to read, just to get an idea of how it plays out.
Let's say the same people who are waging these operations overseas to alter the political environment, say in South America or Southeast Asia, say they wanted to alter the political environment here at home, which I don't think they're. I think they're very concerned with the political situation here at home as well, if not more. They applying those methods, they would try to exploit the fears and so-called superstitions, or things that would affect Americans. What would that be? That would be maybe fear of instability, fear of serial killers. So, yeah, children to go out and play anymore. Children to go out and play and deal with one another and develop those skills. They're going to be less likely to be independent thinkers, and they're going to be antisocial. They're going to go on video games and become gamers and be more manipulatable, right? I mean, right. That's where it's so chilling, because you're like, I mean, it's hard to believe that actually people think this way. But again, your average common man's only ambition is to live a quiet life. They can't fathom trying to manipulate society this way, So, yeah.
Yeah, they can't fathom that there would be classes of people that even. I mean, that's just so far out of their way of thinking that it doesn't even enter into the realm of possibility. So absolutely.
And the various think tanks and psychiatric associations, these institutions, the Pentagon, DOD, where people are well paid to think this way.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's just take one of the MK Ultra doctors, Jose Delgado, has a book called Mind Control.
And it's still people.
That's just one example.
I think you're talking about a Hollywood movie, as if it doesn't exist, as if advertising isn't one level of mind control.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole rise of advertising is concurrent with the rise of really scientific psychological warfare, especially after out of World War II. There's an excellent book. It's one of the classics of psychological warfare that comes out of World War II, where it's an analysis of Nazi propaganda and Allied propaganda. What is it? It's a guy's name starts with Landis or
not Lansdale, is it?
I can't remember his name, but that it may be. But it's well known. It's written in the 50s, I think. But even though it's a little dry, it's worth reading, because what you see is that the techniques of dropping pamphlets and all that. What the pamphlets are, of course, specified and scientifically done as well in a certain way to appeal to local sensibilities. So what the intelligence agencies do is they do all these ethnographies where you know everything about local dialects, local traditions, you have to know everything about the people that you can. I have some old 70s CIA manuals and textbooks that were actually used at Langley and of course declassified now, but they're excellent to read for getting an understanding of how this still goes on, because you have to know everything you can. So you need to know, even to the point of like how people linguistically have different ways of saying things, and so that will factor into the propaganda that you're going to use, because you can't just write out a paragraph of English and try to propagandize some villager somewhere using. It's got to be tailored and specified to that niche. And so exactly, and that's exactly what these think tanks do and foundations with their policy papers and strategies that go after these different niches. So that the targeted message to feminists has got to be one way. The targeted message to blacks and people in low income areas has got to be a certain way. And it's all completely scientifically done, and it's completely. I mean, Rand is always, of course, the best example for this, or because Rand is who really transitioned us to a consumerist society out of a industrial production based society into a debt-based consuming society based on their strategies and plans. So, that can't get any. I mean, you can't get any clearer than that. Once you get people
consuming and following that carrot, it's easy to control them. You can, so. And which is what
exactly
I want to bring up and to get your thoughts on this, because as I listen, I'm kind of I'm kind of a synthesizer of these various ideas, and I take in a lot of various opinions on these things, particularly on the conspiracy angle regarding these incidences, like Sandy Hook and all that. Yeah, because I'm not a
As I
witness.
try
I
to do
wasn't
too.
there, and so I didn't witness these things. So I'm as blind as anyone else, really, and dependent on anyone else's information that comes in. And I'm mindful of that. So I'm skeptical. I realize there can be some false leads, cognitive infiltrators, and things like that. But there's still a lot of acrimony within the so-called truth community in these things, because again, I was listening to a podcast recently. They were talking about CIA in the movies, and the host of the podcast, who I like, well, actually, I'll say his name's Tom Secker. I like him. His analysis is very interesting. He comes out of the UK, and he has this thing called CIA in the movies. It's a series he did this year. Very interesting, and they were going a little bit off on some of the I guess you could say the no planers and the no deaths at Sandy Hook and all that. And I'm not committed one or the other on that issue. I just know there are some anomalies which defy an explanation, which has me wondering. But
Right.
so the people discussing this issue go on to say these people who say that no one was killed are just complete nuts. You know, they're going to alienate the general public, and they're going to undermine any ground or cause the truth movement to lose whatever ground they've gained in the past few years by exposing these obvious false flags. And so, okay, well, that's their views and all that. But then what I found was very interesting is as they were talking about the CIA and its role in culture and movies, they're talking about how intelligence itself has always been a game of magic, as in experimenting in the occult. And if you go back to the history, I thought that was interesting because, well, if this is true, if that really is a question of altering reality, tricking people, then of course technology would determine to what extent you can do that, or what's ever at your disposal. Mm-hmm. But if you look in the history of the intelligence world, it did involve conjurers. Like, I guess you're familiar with John Dee, the Elizabethan guy. He was into,
Absolutely.
He was a philosopher, a mathematician, but he was also in the occult, and he was a conjurer. He was a magician. And of course, then there's Aleister Crowley, who's this, Satanist magician. Mm-hmm. He was also involved in intelligence. And now we have the, mm-hmm. yeah, absolutely. And then of course he established the OTO, the Order Templi Orientis, something like that, which gave birth to the Process Church, which some say had links to the Manson cult and all that. But then you also have, of course, Anton LaVey and these characters, and there are these connections. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the big names is this guy Michael Aquino, who's with the NSA. But before, he was involved in the Phoenix program. He's another Satanist involved in the occult. So you see what I'm saying? There's sort of a connection here to those weird black magic occult stuff to intelligence, because it's all about conjuring and confusing. Do you have anything to say on that? I mean, Okay, go ahead. I mean.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah. There's no doubt in my mind that that's 100% connected, because, like we said last time when we were talking, there's a you're essentially trafficking in secrets, and so secret information has direct connect to the type of things that intelligence agencies are doing, as well as what so-called occultists are doing. So, in regards to, say, Crowley, it's interesting that he says it's Liber something. I forget the exact title of the work. I've quoted it in a few articles, but he says, in this book it is spoken of Sephiroth and the paths of spirits and conjurations, gods, spheres, and planes, many other things that may or may not exist. It's really immaterial whether these exist or not, because by doing these things, certain results will follow. Students are most earnestly warned against attributing objective reality to any of this. And that's important because and even Aquino says this, what's really going on here is more so the management of perception. And so if you can think about, Katy Perry at the Super Bowl, there's all these dumb internet articles talking about, her intentionally being, some sort of signifier of the end of the world. I wrote an article about how dumb that was, but But what is being done is utilizing archetypes and symbology and imagery to project an image into the minds of those seeing it. And if you can, regardless of whether she's obviously not a goddess, but if you can make her appear to be, or if you can have the perception of the mass audience treat her as if she were, then that's pretty much the same thing, at least from the vantage point of perception. So that's all black ops and psychological warfare is, and that's really what the black magician is doing. He's doing the same thing. He's distracting you and getting you to believe based on the illusion, and most of the time people are willing to and desiring to believe in some sort of deception or illusion because it's easier and it's fun to think that you've got these powers or he's got these powers or whatever. So I view it more so as perception management, and that's how it relates to black magic in terms of stage magic. It's essentially the same thing, and that's what psych warfare is. It's defeating the opponent mentally. And there's the famous quote of Sun Tzu that most of warfare is fought in mentally, not on the battle. So if you can defeat your opponent in terms of his mind, then you don't even need to waste your troops. So all the way back to John Dee. I think John Dee was a con man, as were many of the so-called occultists. But being a con man does not necessarily negate their importance, because they were at least able to con quite a few people, especially if you could con a king or a queen into thinking that you had the power to transmute base metals into gold. Well, then you had your use at court. So, by the way, all of this is in. I don't know if you watch Game of Thrones, but it's fascinating because all of this is in Game of Thrones. You have all the same kind of trickery, court deception, alchemists, scamming people, and different geopolitical strategies and so forth, spies, all going on in that fiction show. So everybody can watch Game of Thrones and figure out what's going on, but they can't figure out what's going on in the real world. And that ultimately, I think, that's the place of Hollywood. That's the place of, that's why Hollywood is a magical entity, is because it exists to control the perception, to manage perception, and to create the fictional narratives that speak not just to our conscious mind, but also
and
to our
subconscious. And there was a liaison office
from
the CIA to Hollywood, and same with the DOD, and that's probably, yeah.
As well as with the Pentagon and the Navy, which... Yeah, I mean, there's some good documentaries on that. I think it goes a lot deeper than that. I mean, I think when you're getting into, especially A-list actors, I think you're talking, my suspicion, and I have no direct evidence, but, like with Jennifer Garner, people like that, my suspicion would be that a lot more of these people are working for intelligence than most even conspiracy theorists would be willing to grant. And again, I don't have direct proof of any kind of recruitment, scenarios, but, we do have these little hints and, things that come out here and there. I thought it was odd that you mentioned it was Dave McGowan was on another podcast where he mentioned Bradley Cooper playing Chris Kyle, and Bradley Cooper being seen in those photo ops with the apparent troop crisis actor from the Boston bombing situation.
I've seen that, yeah.
Well, I find it odd that Bradley Cooper in Alias, also with Jennifer Garner, in the show's narrative, he's a journalist who gets recruited into the CIA. I don't know, or I don't have any proof that he is. Right, but I do. There's just too many instances of, film narratives having, predictive programming and things like that to take it as coincidence. I mean, I've just seen, as a student of film, I've just seen it so many times that it just, can't be happening. And especially studying Bond and all the Bond films. I mean, those are just packed with stuff.
He goes to the moon landing.
It's all over.
Thing. That was funny.
Diamonds Are Forever. That is funny, and Diamonds Are Forever. Yeah, I mean, I mean, there's, you can, for example, in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, there's a little neat nugget that I noticed where in the book, Blofeld's plan is to use atmospheric spraying and biowarfare and vaccines under the cover of mind control projects where he's studying all these girls for allergies. What he's actually doing is brainwashing them. And he's going to set up these, he's setting up an inoculation operation to inoculate all of Britain as a biowarfare attack, right? Now, to me, that's odd that's what's going on. And if I recall, the novel doesn't mention the vaccines, but in the film narrative, they stuck in Blofeld explicitly saying, I'm going to do it through vaccines, Mr. Bond, So, you see all kinds of things like this that, after you see hundreds of them, it's just at a certain point, it's like, well, come on, this can't be accidental. And I think it's sprinkled all throughout film as a way to, condition the populace, the most obvious reason to condition people to accept it. So even though they may not consciously be aware 10 years later that they saw it, it's still stored in their memory somewhere in that subconscious sitting there that, in the future, you're going to be doing this. In the future, there's going to be terrorists everywhere. In the future, there's going to be this.
But that would go with your I think your thesis regarding the Bond genre or the Bond series of films is that it's projection, whereas Spectre and Blofeld are actually, they're the ones carrying out the Anglo-American agenda. Yeah, it's kind of like really.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And really to seal the deal on that one is that when you read about Fleming himself, I mean, he was high-level naval psyops, so he was not just a low-level naval officer. He was actually doing, pretty heavy-duty Allied psyops work.
After the war, many of the people that went on to head CBS and NBC, Sign-Off, William Perley, they were all psyop guys from the wartime psyop guys.
Yeah, even David Rockefeller spent a good bit of time when he was young doing
that was their
intelligence
thing. And, of course, the broadcast corporations developed out of the government. And with the licensing and all that, they were always in bed with the government. And, of course, that much was admitted with in the 70s with Colby when he said that they had 400 of the top journalists on the payroll. And just recently we've had the West German, the German reporter admit that, too. Yeah, I can't.
Udo or whatever his name was.
That he was and that they're on the payroll.
I know you're talking about. Yeah.
You take that into consideration, that to the extent that the media is the mockingbird media, that events could be faked, and the infrastructure is there, the people are in place, the methods of control, it's all there. And so to suggest that it's a possibility, I don't think is too far of a stretch.
Well, let's not forget the greatest hits of fake news from CNN. I mean, we think back to that clip that everybody's seen of the Gulf War.
How can you watch that and believe anything?
And there have been some, right? There have been some gems of late as well. With I don't remember his guy, but he's supposed to be reporting from some. Yeah, I saw some sea somewhere, and he's bouncing on the. And it's just completely a green screen. I mean, it's not even
I remember when the Sandy thing broke. This is the level of fake. And this example is being lazy, but of course you had this scene of police rushing into the school. And of course it was a school, but it was another school, and it was a drill occurring some 50 miles away. And they're passing off as the Sandy Hook thing. And okay, so they've done that. And then you also had the incident. Of course, you mentioned the Gulf War incident, but you also, for what incident I was about to think of, another incident is complete fakery. But you've incident, where they're just, they're not there, or they're where they claim to be, or some girl's saying that she's in flood water, and some guy walks behind her, But those are trivial examples. But there are more profound examples of this, of complete fakery. And guess once they've been caught doing that, it's,
you would think you'd lose credibility, but you don't.
There's been some speculations regarding Sandy Hook. I've heard evidence that there's no evidence the school actually ever have been closed for several years. People have been trying to get the records that would prove that, but they can't seem to get the records. Yeah.
Yeah, I followed a lot of that too with Halbig and all that, and it's just even when you get into it's just like with 9/11, there's already disinfo even
exactly.
in amongst the so-called truthers. So and that's all part of the the psyops, smoke and mirrors, dust storm of confusion. But what we can do is look at the undisputable anomalies and the things that are there. I mean, I often criticize empiricism in my on my site. That's an ideology that comes out of the Enlightenment. So I'm not criticizing empirical information and data. That's very, very crucial and important. I'm very much a supporter of that, obviously. So if we can, just basic logic, basic reasoning, can investigate these things and look and see that there's obvious anomalies. I mean, there's just so much with Sandy Hook that doesn't make sense, especially with the character of Adam Lanza himself, as well as apparently possibly a creation or a fiction.
There's no pictures of him in the
looks like a composite, right?
There's all types of weird anomalies, and so. And
then one of the principles I would recommend. This is something I came up with this week, where in the alternative media conspiracy realm or whatever, it's what I call Occam's phaser, and I call it Occam's phaser because it works on the principle that when in doubt between different options, always choose the most outlandish, exotic answer.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of people tend to do, is that they immediately jump to the most ridiculous, outlandish example, which, as I'm sure you're well aware, alternative media is most of the time, quite often, either spooks or kooks, as I say. So, whether they're goofballs that actually believe something crazy and outlandish, I think we should adhere to the principle that, conspiracies are common, and espionage is common, and trickery and deception are common, but really exotic things are not common. So I wouldn't jump to the most outlandish synopsis, but as you pointed out, there are obvious anomalies, as with 9/11, as with any of these other instances, where we can definitely say, from an empirical standpoint, I'm justified. Let me speak in the language of a philosopher here and say, as an individual, I'm epistemically justified in having doubt and skepticism and looking at alternate explanations. And so, when people ask about specific conspiracies, or say about the moon, I don't have a definite set view of that scenario, but I do believe that given all of the other instances of deception and trickery, I am rational and epistemically justified. I'm well within my epistemic rights as a philosophical thinker to have skepticism about situations that don't add up. For example, this is just the most obvious one to me. NASA, on the one hand, puts out a complete, total narrative that I'm supposed to accept about the moon, and at the same time, NASA consistently and constantly promotes aliens. I do not believe in aliens. Now, I'm on the horns of a dilemma, as are you and all other people out there, because what are you going to do in this situation? I mean, if you accept that the moon situation is absolutely correct because of NASA's, pedigree or something, well, then why are they promoting
irrational
alien
balloon? Irrational, okay. I think.
Yeah. So for me, that's a contradiction, where I'm within my rights to say, well, I am skeptical of whatever NASA tells me. That does not mean that I don't think they, build rockets and do things, but I suspect that NASA is probably kind of a public front that's out there to, operate for the public purview, while meanwhile there's all kinds of, the continuation essentially of the SDI, Star Wars Defense Initiative. That's the black budget space tech,
which might explain
secret
UFOs,
stuff is what's
because
really
there are just unidentified scientists. Black technology.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind.
Do you really
that's
think that
what
we're
UFOs
privy
are.
to the
Absolutely.
the best, most advanced technology? No. It's you know.
Well, look at yeah. Running Man. That I'm not 87, okay,
Yeah.
and he's using the Infonet. Now, yeah, there was like one or two newscasts I've seen where some local news said, in the 80s, in the future there'll be the internet. You'll dial from your phone, and your computer will use your phone. But I had no idea what the internet was in the 80s. And my dad was in the Navy. He had no idea what the internet was in the 80s. And I mean, most people did not know what the internet was in the 80s. So, just one little nugget example there with, the Running Man. He's sitting there ordering a plane ticket on the Infonet. That suggests that, that's another consistent pattern we see, that the preparation for the mass populace for this really advanced stuff is oftentimes done through
has
film.
Leaked reports, and also there's been evidence the government has encouraged the UFO or the alien phenomenon in order to either to confuse people, to divert attention away from something, and also or to recently we've had a slew of experts or people commenting maybe we need to stir up an alien threat to unite the world, or so this thing, whether it's in the movies too, right? So that is a meme that's put out there, and it might be to do that. It's a psyop, and people can be kidnapped, right? Even these abductions can be operations.
And when you get into the Black Ops stuff in relation to alien deceptions, you find a lot of the same characters.
Yeah.
You see people like Aquino popping up. You see John B. Alexander, Colonel John B. Alexander, who was, as I understand, been involved in the development of non-lethal weapons technology. So this is definitely an inside military-industrial complex person, character, important figure who's very much, in the background of all these alien stories. And then, of course, Hollywood picks up on this. But for this, the best example you could find is I think there's evidence to suggest the Hadley Cantrell's Invaders from Mars, that the Orson Welles War of the Worlds broadcast was actually a
I know the
psyop.
Rockefellers took a very strong interest in the reaction to it. Yeah.
Exactly. And then there's a book on that, and that was studied for psyop purposes. But that's really kind of one of the early. There it is right there. There's a psyop of alien BS, and people fall for it. So the alien cover has a lot of different uses, but it's utilized for New Age religion stuff with Raelians and people like that. These different UN type groups and UN New Agey type stuff, and what was it a few months ago? Or even in mainstream news, that the CIA admits declassified that the 50s alien stuff was all them. So all that MJ Magic 12,
and
all that stuff, that's just
more or less take a lot of the oxygen up in the room. If you get people's attention, if you get a group of people who are maybe naturally skeptical and you spend their time researching that, they're not going to look at other things. And and to me, the most immediate explanation, the most plausible explanation for some of these things people see is that there are aircraft or space vessels or vehicles that have been made or developed based on occulted or secret knowledge or technology that they haven't revealed. And of course, we all get into the Nazis, the whole story about the Nazis and the flying saucers after World War II, and how they were brought in and to develop aircraft, and maybe,
Well, yeah, I think that's there you go. And that one's a pretty no-brainer there. That if the Nazis are working on Foo Fighters and these, frisbee-shaped craft, and then in paperclip they come here and they go to Britain and they go to
Roswell
the
47,
Soviet Union
right
as
after
well.
the war, so. Yeah.
Well then, yeah, that's what's going on. I mean, it should be a no-brainer in my mind. But as to there being secret tech, that is a different question. I think that's absolutely true. And if they're working on Foo Fighters in the 40s and 50s, then there's no telling what's been developed now. Especially, I do think there's evidence to show that the technologies that Tesla developed had the potential for kind of a revolution in physics based on a different metaphysic than what the Royal Society puts out for mass consumption. I do think there's evidence to suggest this, especially the more that you read about Tesla. And I don't mean to be getting into really esoteric stuff, but there are alternate secret versions of technology. Unfortunately, the Tesla 0-point energy field is populated with a bunch of con men and deception as well. But there's something to this, because we think about the internet itself. I mean, this idea goes back to, wireless goes back to Tesla. So Tesla had an alternate metaphysic that originally was informed by his, Serbian Orthodox upbringing. And then he later got into things like theosophy. But what he retained from this was, the idea of there being ether and there being sort of this, subtle further layer of reality that sort of integrates all the others, that the other dimensions, if you will, the three dimensions. And the existence of ether can be tapped into. It can be used to transmit information, data, energy. And we see all of that now. We see stories of, wireless transmissions of energy, whatever one's opinion of the different perspectives on quantum physics are. And I do believe and understand that a lot of that is tainted with New Age gobbledygook and deception as well. But when I read people like Werner Heisenberg and guys like that, they confirm, for me at least, that a lot of what Tesla was saying was accurate. And that's why the Navy confiscated his documents and his papers. Well, originally I think it was the FBI or some government group, but now the Navy supposedly has possession of Tesla's documents. But the document, there's a lot of Tesla stuff that's not declassified, but supposedly the documents saying that his documents are classified are declassified. So, maybe those are fake too. I don't know. But if I look around and I see, cell phones, transmitting data wirelessly, and when I look at EMF, ELF, VLF technology and the stuff that Aquino talks about, for example, in his PSYOP treatises about, electromagnetic warfare and what can be done to the body and the body's frequencies through frequency warfare. That to me says that, all of this stuff, directed energy weapons, etc., all of that, goes back to Tesla and is very real. And they're obviously working on a different version of physics than what, than the mass consumption physics that, I was taught, for example, in
there was, I guess,
college and high
Joseph
school.
Farrell does a lot of work on that, the Nazi Bell, and yeah. I mean, I've interviewed Farrell once, and I have some disagreements with Farrell, so I'm not trying to. I think that some of that's right, and I don't mean to. I'm not trying to. How can I say this? I agree and disagree with Farrell, and I'm not ripping off Farrell. In fact, the first interview I did with Farrell was around 2008, I think, and I'd not read any of his stuff except his theological trilogy, and we got onto the subject of ether because his book turns out his book, Unified Field Theory, is based on ether and all that. So. Obviously I have been influenced by Farrell, but there's a lot of that I'm very skeptical of. The Giza Death Star.
I don't think the pyramids were.
Yeah, that kind of gets me.
I don't think the pyramids.
His international Nazi stuff is interesting because I think there's a lot to that. It explains the post-war world.
exactly. And I do think, yeah, and I think that there has to be, just from my own research of Platonism and the history of metaphysics. I spent most of my 20s studying ancient and medieval metaphysics and theology, so it's not a subject that I'm new to, and I definitely think that there's a suppressed, again, I don't mean in a New Age sense, but there is a suppressed version of metaphysics and teaching about the natural world, especially, that we're not given, and we're given a an atomistic. Newtonian, 300-year-old approach to these questions that is completely outdated. And so, my view is that the technology that DARPA is doing, the stuff that's, probably 30 years ahead of us, as that we know about, is based on all that. And for proof of that, I would say, look at what Werner Heisenberg says. He says the subatomic particles demonstrate Platonic forms, Pythagorean forms. They don't demonstrate, quote, materialism.
And yes, that sort of revolutionary approach undermines the given power structure. It's like, I think it was J.P. Morgan, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, when Tesla explained his theory about this energy, and he supposedly said,
right.
Well, how do I charge for that?
Right, exactly. Now, I thought I find it fascinating that Tesla, the company Tesla, is putting out these supposedly more efficient home batteries. I think that's interesting. I don't know why that would be permitted, but I don't know. I mean, well, if Tesla's right, then or if the legends about free energy and all that are right, then that would mean that has to be completely controlled. So you can't. The powers that be are going to want to release that technology in their own time.
Explanation of what's going on, because we don't live in especially in energy and industry and economics in general, we don't live in a free market. it's not even close to it.
No, not at all. I mean, when you look
how
at
corrupt it is, it's amazing.
I had not thought much about energy and energy companies in relation to geopolitics until the last few years, and I read a few books on it that were really interesting. Again, I would not. I have a lot of skepticism towards this person, but his book is full of a lot of facts that you won't find anywhere else, and that's Michael Ruppler's book, Crossing the Rubicon. I disagree.
Well, that comes.
I disagree with his peak oil stuff.
Technocracy. King Hubbard, right?
It does, exactly. But it does, but Crossing the Rubicon has all kinds of facts that I've not seen elsewhere. Interesting little insights and details and information in relation to black markets and energy and all that. So it is worth reading for that, especially when you look at the P-Tech stuff and the Inn's Law situation with the back doors and a lot of the same stuff that say Espelin talks about in Shadow Masters, where he points out the black market in relation to the global economy and energy. And Ruppert, I think, was invaluable for just for that aspect, for how much of the black market is really funneling, not just because it's all interconnected, as I'm sure you're aware. I mean, it's not like you have the drug trade over here and then you have this other thing over here. I mean, the banks are at the top of this thing, kind of sucking all the, like a big parasite, like a big battery, kind of sucking all the energy out of everything below it. So
debt-based money is like
absolutely
the craziest idea I ever heard. It makes no sense. It makes sense if you're a monopolist, though. And Rupert, there's a life that would be a subject for a great biography or documentary, because it looks like his entire life he was victimized by the national security state. He had a fake relationship. I think his fiance tried to recruit him, and then his life was threatened when he was at LAPD, because he was involved in some. He saw the drug running that was occurring in LA. That was reported by by the San Jose Mercury News. You don't know. I don't know what.
Yeah, but I mean,
know,
I just don't know. I mean,
speak
I don't.
for him, or testify to the fact that he was not somehow controlled or maybe unwittingly controlled. But he was definitely onto something. I during the early days of 9/11 and years, I watched a lot of his lectures and explaining the direct connection with Wall Street and stuff like. So there's definitely a lot there to learn from by reading him or watching him. As there's a lot of people just got to look at it with skepticism. And he might have had some of the answers. He might have been misled in some other things, like all of us, right? It's just one of those things.
Sure.
So wow.
Well, that's what I think. What's so for me in the last 5 years, what's been really a help was branching out into trying to read good material in different subjects. So not just reading quote conspiracy stuff. And if there are people who want to advance their understanding, their research, I would recommend branching out into espionage and geopolitics and economics. Yeah. So exactly, and you really need that broad next level of studying things beyond.
Here's the problem: in order to do that, you have to put in the time and read, and that's a lot for a lot. That's a lot to ask for a lot of people because,
I guess it is. Yeah, I was raised by
it was there.
Yeah, was an editor and a librarian, so I was raised by books.
That's the problem. But then again, there's ways you can get. There's other medium you can use. I mean, YouTube has been good for that, and so if it can draw someone's interest and make them want to read about something, then that works. But reading differently because you definitely take in the most information. It's the higher order of thinking and mental ability when you're reading, and so you really have to read. And it's kind of you're alone with your book.
Absolutely.
And you and the author are engaging in a dialogue, and it's nothing like it. And that's why they're trying to just. Exactly. That's why you have Common Core. You want to destroy reading.
Absolutely. Oh, totally. There used to be when I was in high school. There were like 10 bookstores in Nashville that I could go to and drive around and. I used to look forward to driving and hitting up all the bookstores when I was 18. Now
that's sort of
there
the
are 2 or 3. So.
Concentration, which all the broad economic conditions and all the decisions tend to be limited, destroying the small, mid-sized companies that gave people jobs and opportunities, and they're corporatizing everything. Because these corporations, they're the ones that are lavished with the the drug funds, with the cheap capital from the central banks, and they're able to use that leverage to destroy the smaller firms that don't have that advantage.
Yeah, I felt like such a dummy having read all this conspiracies. I started reading conspiracy stuff when I was about 18, and it wasn't until about 29 that I was starting to look at. Oh well, there's all this black market stuff.
I was in my late 30s.
A big part of this.
Really looking at this stuff.
Well, that black market stuff is again such a big part of it that I was just clueless
about.
And
everything.
In my 20s.
It makes you look at the police, everything like it's all a big facade. It's all corrupt. It's just awful. It's just but then again, you shouldn't be dispirited because if you take in the broader look, this is the way the world has always worked, and as we the principalities and powers have always belonged to the devil. So, yeah.
Well, it makes me think back again to, what Machiavelli says in Art of War. He's very pragmatic in it, and, he's sort of laying out strategies for rulers. So all those principles, from hundreds of years ago are still applicable, all the way back to Sun Tzu.
Well, Jay, I've kept you a long time tonight. I'm going to let you go. So that's I want to thank you for.
It's okay.
Coming on the show again tonight to go deeper into these things. It's always a great talk. Again, you can go on forever with these things because there's, it's a lifetime of learning. Again, go to jaysanalysis.com, read his articles, and support him. He does good research. Thank you, Jay. Good night.
Thanks, Tim. Bye.